Australia. I can see a map behind you, Lawson.
Yes.
To officially welcome you warmly to our little session, which will take about half an hour. And we're going to be talking about Indigenous languages and translation. So let me just very briefly introduce you. We've worked on a couple of projects. You are Lawson Stapleton,
Yeah.
and you are from ABC Multilingua. Tell us a little bit more about how you got into this space. And I know from working with you that Indigenous languages, and languages generally speaking, are your passion. So what I would like you to do is just tell us a bit more about yourself, if you may.
Of course. Basically, I was a very lucky kid. I traveled a lot when I was younger, and part of that was summer holidays in Alice Springs, where I was exposed to Indigenous communities at an early age, dominantly though of the Aranda and Warlpiri countries. So you're talking Hermannsburg all the way up to Yundamu. So it was something sort of I was exposed to, but in my previous career or time, didn't really have the opportunity to work closely with. But then 5 years ago, we received a call basically asking for assistance in Indigenous languages. And at that point in time, we didn't offer those languages or a service as such. And basically we were through a bit of hard work and a very long story, we were able to sort of progressively set up. So we went from not servicing any Indigenous languages to now serving, I think it's 26 now, and assisting 300 individuals a month.
And Lawson, for those of us who don't know, how many languages are spoken actively, Indigenous languages spoken actively in Australia?
That is a hell of a question. So to be very accurate, because there is a lot of static around this for multiple reasons. So they estimate pre-colonial, there were more than 300 spoken languages. Due to colonialism, particularly along the coastal regions, they sort of retreated and became extinct. So to answer your question, as far as live living languages, I would say everyday use, probably between 30 and 45 that are fluently spoken, interactive with services. I might be missing a couple. But it is a bit hard to ascertain as there's a huge revival program at the moment. So in South Australia, we have revival for the Kaurna language. So there are government grants there, and Queensland is offering $10,000 grants as well for revival languages. So a lot of government services are getting confused about, okay, is this politely, is this an everyday spoken language, or is this a revival language? So I guess that's why it's a bit hard to answer.
But there's a few dozens, let's put it that way. And sure. How come would you say translating into Indigenous language is such a new thing? And, you know, notwithstanding the politics of it, or the fact that maybe the literacy levels are low, and sometimes translating Indigenous language is completely useless. But why are we talking about this now?
It's a great question. I think that it really comes down to pop culture. I think AFL has been the fire that lit that up with Adam Goodes, with his matter that drew a lot of focus on Indigenous nations. And I think that's the first time where Indigenous people were heard about their side of the story on such a huge platform. And I think that's also what opened up one of the biggest problems I think we come across is that people go, oh, Aboriginal, Indigenous, as a whole, when we have so many different nations, so many different cultures, so many different languages going on. So I really think it's come out of pop culture, and through that we have, for example, Baker Boy, who's a Yolngu feather from East Arnhem, and he raps in his mother tongue, Yolngu Mara. I'm pretty sure it's Damapanyu, and English. So it's sort of it's sort of, it's pop culture, and also because it's in English and language, it pulls that interest. Plus, he makes awesome music. So I think just through pop culture, it's really become something. And then with sort of NAIDOC weeks building momentum, it's been awesome. So I think federal and state governments have just put it more on their agenda, because now that they're seeing what's really going on.
And I think, in case you don't know, I've learned everything there is about Australia from a film called, it was actually a series called Return to Eden. So okay. I came to Australia at the age of 18, but when I was about 16, I don't even know, you're too young to know what I'm talking about. but it's a soapy with David Rain and a few sort of like, you know, famous actors. But we were fascinated by this amazing culture, and you know, Aboriginal Indigenous themes feature very heavily in it, including crocodile and all kinds of stuff that very, very weird. If you can find it, look it up, because it's you know, this is in the days of no internet and no idea immigrants when we came out here. And of course, Australia is nothing like it. But what I'm trying to illustrate, that I probably knew when I came here in 1986 more about, from that film, more about Indigenous culture and languages, as limited as it was than an average Australian. Is that still the case, would you say? Or are we progressing? Are we giving respect to the traditional owners of this land?
Yes and no. I think I think it just stems from educational system in schools where, you know, for example, I'm a great example. We did Australian studies for 1 year out of, you know, 14 years of school, and it was about Burke and Wills, it was about Flinders, and it was about Captain Cook. There wasn't really any Aboriginal content, so therefore I only knew it from a European colonial perspective. So I think it sort of stems from there. And then when anything Indigenous is really in the news, unfortunately, it doesn't do justice to all the great things. So unfortunately, it'll be about social issues, or it will be about something political. And the majority of people don't like engaging in political or social matters. And so I think that causes a bit of an abrasive divide in that's all I've been exposed to. And what I've found over the course of developing this over 5 years is that initially that is the case. And then when we have an open discussion so we have to convince it's a safe environment to talk about these matters, and people sort of let their walls down, it's so easy. I think the angst of the two sides of the fence is just that, am I going to listen? Are they going to listen? Do you want to understand me? And that's something we do by incorporating our interpreters into matters. So, you know, if clients of ours want to know more about culture, I'll ask an interpreter, you know, ask my honorary uncle or grandfather, brother, sister, hey, can you come along and, you know, do you want to talk about country? And they'll go, yeah, and we sort of bring it down that way. But yeah, unfortunately, I think the majority of Australia is only just sort of being exposed to these fantastic cultures and having appreciation for these beautiful languages, the artwork, how family works, how, you know, if you're brought up in, I think just this concept of we're all Australian, how can we be so different in ways? And it's like, it's just starting to be, people are having open ears. I'll say so.
And Lawson, speaking of the last 5 years, it probably has been, I've been in business for 20, so just a bit longer, but has it been a completely crazy, wild ride of exciting developments, or have you been able to get it down to the point where you actually know what you're doing? Because I've been in business for 20 and I still don't, so, you know, I'll take the cue, as they say, but what have you learned in working in this space that you can share with others, because we have done a couple of projects together. If it wasn't for you, we'd be, I don't know what we would do. So I can tell you, and I've told you this, but I can tell others that without your respect for the language, for the people that you work with, for your clients, I think the project wouldn't be as good, or it wouldn't have happened in the first place. But what I really appreciate is the time that you take to educate people. And it looks to me like ABC Multilingua is about that as much as, you know, making a living and all of that stuff. But education, it seems to me, that's my experience, is the core of what you do.
It's well, I had hair when I started. Not really. I think the best word to sum it up is rewarding. It's definitely been challenging. When I first started, I took the same approach of the international languages that I did with Indigenous, and that didn't really get me anywhere, not because there were any conflicts or resilience, but it was more so let's talk about things before we get into it. And so I spent a huge amount of time just listening and trying to understand, and how previous events might affect trust, or might affect ambitions, or might affect availability, and just learning about culture, how, you know, the family tree works differently. And it was just eating a huge piece of humble pie and realizing that even though I'm in charge of creating this service, I'm actually the passenger. And I had to learn to take a back seat and sit back, listen, and just, you know, have our own sort of little negotiations, you know, like, hey, what are your expectations? What would you like to do? What don't you want to do? Asking for guidance. Am I taking the right approach, or can I do things better? Those sorts of things. And I suppose it's a little bit strange sort of being the manager and taking a back seat and just, yeah, eating a huge amount of humble pie. But once that sort of happened, it was magical. Everything became a lot easier. Everything became far more transparent. My life was far less stressful because my expectations were realigned with what was truly possible. So it's been great. And being able to go out to community and seeing where people come from, and you know, creating work that is empowering in language and culture, and being able to share that with the wider world, or the wider Australia, I should say. It's rewarding, truly rewarding.
And tell us, in terms of preserving languages through translation, and I think you've already mentioned a couple of initiatives that are happening, you know, through governmental channels and schools and universities. What does translation do to preserving a language, an Indigenous language?
It's really, I mean, that's a tough one. By preserving, say, for example, we want to work on glossaries. So we're not looking to standardize a language, but we're looking to make a more mutual context, because a way that sometimes Indigenous interpreters, depending on which area they're from, what the audience is, I suppose it'd be a bit like Polish if someone's from the mountains, if they're from Krakow or they're from Warsaw. You appropriate your language according to the audience. But what we're trying to do is make it a little more consistent. So we're creating glossaries. So that's just going to be a forever item that can be accessed. So that would sort of implement and keep, say, Pitjantjatjara in the judicial system forever, by doing translating and working with elders. It's inspiring the younger generations to come through and go, that's what I want to do. So that increases the literacy rates, that increases the want to preserve the language and use it. But mostly we're doing a lot of audio transcribing. So we just find that the audio, depending on the community, is a lot more effective in communication. So I hope I answered the question.
No, you did. You did. And it's, yeah, and look, a lot of it is very new. And I think one of the things you taught me is, and I kind of knew that already, but there's no point of translating in some of the Indigenous languages because no one's going to be able to read it. So you do have to find, well, it's not just about the language, but the method of dissemination or presenting the information. And I still think that out there there's people understand, as you said now, that we need to reach out to various communities in Australia. But how you do it is a big question, and also don't tick boxes. Like if you're going to translate for people that can't read the stuff, that's fine. Yeah,
that is a major issue, and I think, if I can say this without being offensive to anyone, one of the blessings of COVID is that the written documentations were finally found not to be the fastest or most efficient way of informing individuals. So state and federal governments, territory governments opted for the audio transcribing, which it's faster. 100% of people are going to understand it because it's audio. So that was a good change. That was a welcome change. Whereas if you have a written document, by the time it gets done, it's old news. So that was a great transition for us. Great transition.
And what does a day at ABC Multilingua look like? Like what happens? Is it like at Polaron where we're just pretty reactive to everything happens? So have you been able to building processes and systems that you've mentioned that you feel more at ease or at peace? I guess is the way to put it. But what happens on a daily basis with you?
We usually have plan A, B, C, D, and E. Just because there's a lot going on, especially when you work with elders. They have a huge amount of commitments, either in community, land titles, organizations, boards. So, with COVID happening, it's quite difficult to commit all the time.
Mm-hmm.
So we went from basically, I personally carried the Indigenous unit on top of my other workload for the last sort of 4 years, if you will. And in the last 12 months, we've actually developed it into a separate unit, and that's manned or womaned by individuals. So that way our Indigenous interpreters can have a more accessible, faster, basically point of communication, where I was getting to the point where I couldn't commit to that. So now I've got help there, and we've got our Indigenous quarters, and a lot of our Indigenous interpreters are painters. So we've got a painting room as well. So we'll have from any day various artists from different areas painting. We get, we have the discussion. So I don't know, in the morning we'll get an inquiry from, say, a federal government department who wants to work on, say, the Utopia community with the Yaura. So we'll go through that and consult with whoever's here or over the phone. And then about an hour later, we'll have sort of the day schedule sorted by 10 for, say, the courts or health or job seeking, every day sort of appointments.
Mm-hmm.
Usually by about 11, something else will come in for, say, the Ananu, either in Pitjantjatjara or Yunkanjatjara. So we'll go through that. And then usually by lunchtime, we have a whole bunch of interpreters who'll pop in. And yeah, it's sort of, I try to commit as best as I can to, I build around certain things, but there are days where things, don't go to plan, and you just have to do your best. So we try to cover now, for example, with an AVL link. So if an interpreter breaks down or a personal matter happens, family event, we can substitute the on-site with an AVL direct to the courts or telephone interpreting. So yeah, it's sort of, it's probably similar to you guys, where you just sort of, I don't know, go with the flow. Yeah, exactly.
But it sounds to me like you've managed to adapt or adjust. It's a creative pursuit. So we keep talking about innovation and all kinds of stuff. You're already doing it, right?
Yeah, we are.
And that's a model that works for the community. It's a model that works for you, for the interpreters, for translators. So
yeah,
I think to be able to explain it to service users is probably a bit of a challenge. I'm not sure whether you're finding that people are like, what do you mean painting room? What's that?
So basically we have a bit of a rec room with a painting. So with our Indigenous interpreters, because they might live in various areas and most of the matters either happen in the CBD or the north, we basically just sort of thought, well, instead of the interpreter driving or catching public transport for, say, an hour there, they've got an hour block or 2 hour block of nothing, and then they've got something else. We openly welcome our interpreters to come and stay. So, we've got elders that might come in and have a cup of tea, put their feet up, and then, during that time, we might get calls from, say, some of our other clients who need assistance over the phone, and we'll just sort of, when they come in, hey, do you want some downtime, just us to leave you alone, or would you like to take some calls while you're here? And so we sort of just constantly check in to make sure that, our Indigenous staff are basically doing what they want to do, and they at the same time get the respect and appreciation of their other commitments. And I think that's been very well received, in that, if you said, oh, you've got 4 weeks worth of work, and then I've got to go up to community because they're going to, I don't know, do some new structural stuff and I need to be there to talk about, I need to go.
Mm-hmm.
We don't have any animosity. We don't have any fights or biffs, because by setting up a hub, we've got someone else who's equally qualified to step in. So with that rapport and that sort of approach, it's sort of just like check in, check out. And then that way everybody's happy, everything's transparent. It's much easier. Whereas before, we sort of took the approach of being strictly regimented and very, very stern on, I suppose with international languages, we're a bit like that. So, and we found by supporting community events and supporting those community responsibilities, it actually made the Indigenous interpreters want to do more. So it was just really about mutual respect and just knowing each other's stories. So
So I have two more questions.
Sure.
One is, what is your proudest moment? And the second one is, through your work, do you think you're changing people's lives? So, for example, I'm sure that you work a lot in the legal space, in the health space, like any other interpreting company, I guess. But do you think that in the last 5 years you've managed to actually make a real difference through language services that you provide?
Great questions. My proudest moment. I don't know. I don't know whether that's sort of work or personal. Some of the, I mean, for example, we did a cast bronze statue that was designed by Indigenous artists out in Yalata, so West Coast, South Australia.
Mm-hmm.
And that was in regards to a nuclear bomb test site in the 1950s that the radiation affected Ananu and displaced them from their lands. And
Wow.
they made a statue in conjunction with the Nagasaki Peace Park, who were bombed during the Second World War. And that was in cast bronze, translated in Pitjantjatjara and Japanese. That was pretty awesome. But my proudest moments overall are more or less creating a service that's really helping our First Nations people. And the sweetest reward is seeing these individuals who are, I don't know how to word it, but borderline sort of poverty, don't have many opportunities to moving into their own houses, buying their own cars, sending their kids to better schools, having a stable income, and just seeing them grow as individuals. That's just that empowerment is, and just seeing the development is the best part, and that's what inspires me to keep going.
And Lawson, it sounds to me like they are really strong networks, relationships, and friendships, and you did refer to them not just as your colleagues but uncles and brothers, and so it's a very interesting way of looking at your community, because you're now part of it. Would you say that you've kind of been somewhat accepted into the midst of Indigenous communities?
Yes, I just to be clear though, I never had expectations of being accepted in any community, just because it's their land, it's their place, it's their culture. I'm a visitor.
Mm-hmm.
But yes, I would say 9 out of 10, I've been accepted. I have been asked to leave respectfully, and that's, you just got to take that. That's part of it.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, it is hard not to get passionate or personal about it, because you are, when you're in that world, you do become part of the family. Like I have the coolest goddaughter. She's 3 years old. She's hilarious. She's the most colorful, bright spark of all time. And just seeing mum working, a 30-hour week and buying a new car and sending her off to daycare, and that sort of opportunity wasn't coming before. And that sense of confidence and pride that's instilled in that interpreter through using language and culture is just, it's the best reward. That's just the best thing. And in regards to your second question about, I guess, helping lives out and stuff like that, that's something that is part of the driver, internally, externally. So just seeing our interpreters come from nothing to something in some instances. Some are obviously established, but to seeing clients who otherwise wouldn't have had that service 5 years ago, and so readily available and accessible, is pretty cool. It's a nice reminder. And then going out to community and seeing some of these individuals and getting that smile of, I know you're the fella. And so it's just that humanitarian side is the best part by far.
And I think what you're describing, Lawson, is something pretty simple, but it's never easy. It sounds like it's been a lot of hard work, and I think not being patronizing, or you can't assume things, and that respect that you treat your colleagues with and the community with, I think it pays off in terms of creating those really genuine connections. And I think what happens with that information and the education that you receive, you can then pass it on to people that want to produce information for Indigenous communities.
Yeah.
And I think really they need to listen to you and to your colleagues, to your interpreters, translators, because they'll tell you how to communicate effectively. Would you say?
Absolutely. And the sort of next level of that, something that I've noticed is that now that people have engaged in our services and they're feeling more comfortable and they're meeting the interpreters, they're talking about country, they're talking about language, it's sparked quite a large interest in the wider client community to know more about Indigenous history. And I'm currently talking to one of my previous lectures, Professor Alison Holland from Macquarie University, about creating this multifaceted seminar where what I want to do is, for those clients who are interested, again said is growing immensely. So I'd love to do an interpreter Q&A. I would love to do a cultural awareness part of the program. But I would really, really, really love to do an educational segment on colonial Indigenous relations from both sides, to really sort of widen that knowledge and just empower the wider community about, okay, so we know about Captain Cook, we know about Flinders, we know about Burke and Wills, but what about, you know, the Black Wars in Tasmania? What about, you know, the famous warriors of the Darling Harbour in New South Wales? You know, what about in Queensland with indentured labour and things like that? And it's more so, I don't want to get involved in the politics, but it's more so for the individual to sink in and look at, oh, okay, this is the history. Okay, maybe that's what's trickled down and we've got these sorts of things happening today. And so just a safe platform covering all categories, sort of like a super seminar.
Well, you know, whenever you get that off the ground, I want to attend. And I think I would encourage strongly anybody that is listening to do so, because you a wealth of knowledge. Honestly, we found working with you just really amazing. There's no other word to describe it. It's been really a very good experience, despite challenges which come and, you know, go. That's obvious. But we've got 3 minutes and a lot of questions. So I'm going to hand over to Andrea for some questions.
Thank you so much, guys. The first question I have here: how do you think the Aboriginal languages scope will look like in the next 5 or 10 years, especially for the interpreting industry?
Wow, what a question. It's going to, I think what's going to happen without sort of getting this out is that, as mentioned before, we have a lot of revival languages. And that at the moment is causing a bit of static on, okay, do I need an interpreter? Don't I need an interpreter? So I see a lot of revival languages probably coming back into maybe being implemented back into schools. So I think, for example, Ghana might come into the Adelaide local primary school. So I see from that perspective that happening. As far as interpreter sides of continuing strong Indigenous languages, say your Yolngu languages and say your Pitjantjatjara, I think that will continue strongly for the next 5 years. So I see a solid future in servicing the industry with those languages, and I see a strong future of educating in Indigenous languages as a second language in perhaps the Department of Educations in various states.
Perfect, thank you. Is telephone interpreting a main challenge for your interpreters?
Telephone interpreting in the last 2 years is much easier. Just basically Telstra's rolled out the need to put basically their towers, if you will, in rural communities. So the ability to communicate and access by calling is much easier than it was. Previous to 2 years ago, there were communities that didn't have that. And so that was a real pain. So telephone interpreting now, in a nutshell, much easier. It's very convenient, quick.
Thanks. I have a bit of a broad question here.
That's all right.
What are some of those cultural issues that need to be considered when translating content into Indigenous languages, besides the fact that you said written information is not the best option for these communities?
Some of the cultural issues we follow are that when you have traditional communities that are gender-oriented male and female, the new wave of sort of, say, LGBTI in some communities is difficult to navigate, as in there's no homophobia as such. It's just that it hasn't really been recognized or acknowledged in some communities. So when it comes to some of the gender matters, that is difficult. When it comes to certain technologies that might be new and upcoming, they haven't had time yet to sort of permeate and sort of expand their definitions into Indigenous languages. So that takes a fair bit of consultation And how do you go with inventing new words, or coming up with a longer phrase that basically conveys the message but isn't direct? So sometimes that's quite problematic, and that's where I really rely on translators in a community setting rather than one individual dictating. So there are a couple. Sometimes when it comes to written translations, funerals, depending on, business, or if you're from Central Desert Konya, funerals can fluctuate dramatically in time. So if it's Anonu, funerals have gone up to 6 to 8 weeks. So it's a bit of an exodus, plus everyone knows everyone. With Aranda, it could be a couple of days. Walpuri could be a few days plus. Walpuri can be a little more traditional, so there can be some add-ons with delays there. So basically, it's timing is of the essence, and having that backup. I hope that sort of answers.
It does, definitely. And it sounds like it is challenging. Well, look, working with languages and client demands is always a challenge, because what I find difficult, for example, is to explain to people that are lay people and who do not care, how language works, that you can't do certain things, or you have to do certain things in a certain way. So I think it is a matter of trust, but whoever you work with as your colleagues, I think what you showed us today, and very, very eloquently, is that really reaching into the community, reaching into the community of interpreters, translators in a respectful way, giving them space to tell you how they work and how a language works and how it's best to communicate with a group of people is really the way to go. So I wanted to thank you for your time.
That's all right. Thank you for having me.
And for sharing this information, because, sometimes you just have to sort of stop and think. And I think what you said to us today, that we really just making inroads into understanding this ancient culture, this, ancient traditions, and in a respectful way, and, not trying to, what do they call them, putting square pegs into round holes?
Yeah. It's very much so. It's I mean, like, even I was going to say, one of the other problems is health. If you get traditional, say, Pirinja or Ananu, Pirinjara, Yankujara, they have a Nankari, and the Arandadu, I think, is Nankeri, which is a traditional healer. So sometimes there's a bit of a fear prior to communication about receiving, say, cancer treatment, so radiology and chemotherapy. So we have to go through, or the interpreter has to go through an explanation of what is even the concept that I'm being seen to here with cancer treatment. So yeah, there's never a dull moment. It's just rewarding. So sorry, I just ranted then.
No, you well, because it's all about navigating whether it's a linguistic or cultural aspect or political even, which we haven't even touched on. It's really wonderful that you've been able to share that with us. And every time I speak to you, I learn heaps. So what we're going to do is put information about your organization on our social media. And I really want to attend that workshop, and I know that you have a lot on your plate and a lot of really wonderful plans. So please keep in touch. And if anyone wants to reach out, we actually met over LinkedIn when I was having a desperate moment of needing to find some language services in the Indigenous space.
Right.
Let me just tell you that Lawson's been fabulous. That's the only word I can think of. But thank you for joining us, and we will definitely work together, and any workshops, any knowledge that you can develop in a structured way, we'll be there, that's for sure.
Thank you so much for the invitation, and thank you very much for everything. I feel very flattered and humbled. Thank you.
Thank you, and thanks, Andrea, for the questions, which were pretty good.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you, guys.
Okay, have a great what are you having, afternoon yet, or what's
it is 11:34.
Okay, well, no lunchtime for you yet.
No, not yet. I'll wait off.
However, in Melbourne it's 12:04, so with that,
yeah,
and thank you again.
No worries. Have a good lunch. Thank you.
Thanks. Bye.
Thank
Bye.
you. Bye.